Welcome. For those of you who do not know me, I am David McFadden, Professor of History and Director of the Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies Program at Fairfield University. On behalf of all of us at Fairfield University, thank you so much for coming this evening. This event marks the 20th anniversary of Fairfield University's Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies Program, launched in 1994-95 thanks to a generous grant from the PepsiCo Foundation. Other university events in this anniversary year include a major exhibit in the Domena Necelius Library, an upcoming celebration party celebrating all those at Fairfield University and elsewhere who have contributed so much to the establishment and growth of this program, and a special evening marking the publication of a book which lays out the successful work of Fairfield University on business education in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Central Asia. I want to acknowledge several special guests here this evening. First, Ed Du, Professor Emeritus of Politics, who is the original stimulus for this program. He hired me, and a stalwart and creative contributor over many years of this program. Second, and he will be with us in a few minutes, Father Jeffrey P. Von Arx, S.J., my colleague in the Department of History, who has provided much support and collaboration over the past decade and more, and has traveled with me several times to Russia. Third, Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, and the longtime partner of our guest speaker. Finally, give a special welcome to tonight's speaker, Professor Stephen Cohen. Professor Emeritus of History and Russian Studies at New York University and Professor Emeritus of Politics and Russian Studies at Princeton, Steve Cohen has a long and distinguished career as a historian and analyst of Russian and Soviet politics and history. Well known especially for his seminal biography of Nikolai Bukharin, which is over here and for sale in the front of the store. The Kelly presentation room. This shows the power of his analysis, because this biography explores the major figure who was a real alternative to Stalin and Stalinism. And he's known for his path-breaking work, known to all students and scholars of 20th century Russia, rethinking the Soviet experience, politics and history since 1917. He and vanden Heuvel also have pioneered in interviews with Gorbachev's reformers, Voices of Glasnost, and survivors of the Gulag, The Victim's Return, survivors of the Gulag after Stalin. Professor Cohen will be speaking on a most critical issue, as all of you who follow the news must be quite aware. As U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, French President Hollande, and German Chancellor Merkel conduct negotiations in Kiev and Moscow, and as the conflict in eastern Ukraine spirals more and more into open warfare. Professor Cohen's topic is the Ukrainian crisis, why a new Cold War? Following his talk, he will take questions from the audience and will then sign copies of 2 of his books, which are on sale here. Please give a warm Fairfield welcome to Stephen Cohen.
Thank you, David. I used to impress people in weather like this by saying it's nothing for those of us who have lived many years in Moscow. Tonight it's something. And so much of a something that I am amazed so many people are here tonight. I assume that 90% of you are here to honor the 20th anniversary of the Russian, East European, Central Asian Studies program, and the other 10% of you are here to heckle me. I am a veteran of Russian studies programs. My career, 45, going on 50 years, I guess. I've spent my entire scholarly career in Russian studies programs. First at Indiana University, then at Columbia, then at Princeton, where I headed the program, then at NYU, where I'm now at. So I'm appropriate person to say how much we are in debt to Fairfield University for nurturing and founding and nurturing a Russian studies program in the 90s when other universities were closing theirs down because they thought Russian studies was only about national security, as though they'd never heard of Pushkin or Tolstoy or Russia's contributions to science or the rest. So Fairfield is really, I'd say, a pioneer in the post-Cold War, we may be in a new one, Russian studies field. And that makes me very happy because I'm not only a veteran of Russian studies, but I'm a fan and advocate. And believe me, it's a fighting battle to keep them alive, or it was until a year ago. The government had taken its money back, and now it's debating putting it back in the field. That's not the best reason to fund Russian studies, but we take it where we can get it. The other reason I think I'm appropriate person to be here, though I know some of you might not think so, is that I've been here before, haven't I? You recall, Professor Dew. I don't know when it was, but it was about 20 years ago, about the time you founded the program. So, and my wife, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, has been here on her own to debate Bill Kristol, I think, on another issue. So I think we're appropriate, at least generationally, and in terms of our commitment to Russian studies. Normally, my talk tonight would probably be about that. Why, kind of boring, but heartfelt and important, why we need to be studying Russian in this country, just as part of the way we educate our young people and ourselves. Or I might have told you the story of my own educational journey from Kentucky, where I grew up, through Indiana, by chance to Birmingham, England, by chance to Russia, where I began what's been my life with Russia. I have probably spent a quarter of my life living in Russia, and some 90% between marriages and children and grandchildren, thinking about Russia. But these aren't normal times. These are dire times. Our lives and our future, I think, are at stake. I'm now a grandfather, so I could say so are the futures of our children and our grandchildren. These are very fateful times. How fateful? Today we learn, Professor McFadden referred to it, that desperate about what's happened, the president of France and the chancellor of Germany got on a plane and flew to Kiev. It's 8 hours earlier, so yesterday, and now they're on their way to Moscow. And I gather Merkel's coming to Washington tomorrow or the next day. The Europeans are in full panic and want this ended, but they think the train may have left the station. So, our times. The Ukrainian crisis has grown, I think it should be clear to anyone by now, to the most dangerous and possibly fateful international crisis, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I look out in the audience and I see people who not only were not born at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but weren't alive when the Soviet Union ended. But believe me when I tell you that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, literally the discussion was, are we all going to die in a nuclear war? And we escaped that crisis. And if you don't know about it, now's a good time to go back and read about it. People thought it would never come again, but it may be. This is the worst international crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis, because as we talk, the United States and Russia, the two nuclear powers of the world, are getting eyeball to eyeball. The origins of the Ukrainian crisis are to be found back in the 1990s at least. If someone was going to write a history of how we got where we are today, you'd start with the end of the Soviet Union. You might start 400 years ago if you're going to do Ukraine. But the immediate history begins in the 90s. But it's current history. And even the youngest person in this room will remember it. It's been in the newspapers, on the telly, or as Edward Snowden told my wife and I when we interviewed him in Moscow a few months ago, and I said, "You watch TV?" He looked at me like I was crazy. He says, "Nobody watches TV anymore." He says, "I see it on the computer." And then I realized my 23-year-old daughter doesn't have a TV set. So I understand that. But you all know this current crisis that began in November 2013. And its history is clear, and I think the facts of it are not disputable. So we need to remind ourselves of what happened. In November 2013, a political dispute in Kiev over a proposed European trade agreement led to street protests that formed on a famous square called the Maidan, and led then, depending on how you look at it, this is a dispute, to the overthrow or the downfall of Ukraine's elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. He was a rotter, he was corrupt, he wasn't courageous, but he was elected, and everybody agreed the election had been fair in Ukraine. He was made to go away. And that event in Kiev, whether you look at it as a coup, as the Russians do, or as a glorious democratic revolution, as some in the West and in Ukraine do, it's a matter of interpretation, that then led to protests in eastern Ukraine, because Yanukovych represented then, his electoral base was largely in eastern Ukraine. And that then led, directly or indirectly, to Russia's annexation of Crimea. And that led to the onset of the ongoing Ukrainian civil war between the country's not entirely, but largely pro-Russian eastern provinces that border Russia and its western provinces. That civil war grew into a new Cold War between the United States and NATO on the one hand, and Russia on the other. And now, as we talk, it has become a proxy American-Russian war. Russia indisputably is abetting militarily the rebel fighters or the separatists or whatever you want to call them in eastern Ukraine. And the United States, somewhat less openly, is funding and arming Kiev's armies. And as you know, there's now a debate in Washington and a proposal that we fund them much more grandly. I believe $3 billion worth in the next 3 years with much more substantial weapons. Still worse, this new Cold War, and there's no doubt about it, call it by whatever name. The newspapers can't bring themselves to say, they call it the worst crisis since the Cold War. They can't bring them to say it's a new Cold War, fine. They're hung up about this for various journalistic reasons. But this new Cold War may be more dangerous than the last one, which we barely survived. Why? Well, first of all, think about it. The epicenter of the last Cold War was in Berlin, a long way from Moscow. The epicenter of this Cold War is in Ukraine, right plunk on Russia's borders. And moreover, right in the center of Russia's Slavic civilization, which it shares with a large part of Ukraine, not all of it, but certainly with many Ukrainians, through intermarriage, through history, through culture, through language, through religion. So that's why, one reason why, you can imagine all the potential for misunderstanding, mishap, provocation accident 1,000-fold more dangerous than when the center was in Berlin. Secondly, because this Cold War is unfolding in what was called, in the run-up of World War I, a fog of war. That expression refers to misinformation. Before World War I, there was no email, there was no digital communication, so it took a while. It's flying today. It's information from Moscow, yes. It's information from Kiev, it's misinformation from Kiev, it's misinformation from Washington, it's misinformation out of Brussels. Even those of us who are following this, who have the language skills to read it in the original, who know the history, often cannot figure out who's telling the truth and who's lying. It is hard. It is hard to know the actual facts, but it comes down to the fact that the facts are all bad and dangerous and getting worse. Third, it could be more dangerous, this Cold War, because it lacks the mutual rules and practices of constraint that were developed over the decades of the last Cold War. Moscow and Washington worked out certain agreements, the famous red phone, the hotline, the certain, let's check this before we act, a certain agreement that we won't do this and you won't do that, that we had red lines and boundaries that we knew better not be crossed. None of that now exists. None of it. Still worse, decades of cooperative relations with Russia, developed over decades, are now being shredded from education to space exploration. David probably knows other, to cultural. Museums can't get the exhibits. I mean, everything is being shredded. Who's to blame? Both. Everybody's reacting. You shred this, I'm shredding that. There is even talk, which I hadn't heard ever, I think, on both sides, of using tactical nuclear weapons, as though tactical nuclear weapons, because you can only fire them 300 or 1,000 miles, aren't nuclear weapons. They're radioactive. All those restraints that these were no-nos after the Cuban Missile Crisis seem to be gone. Fourth, and this is important, negotiations, attempts to restore cooperation between Moscow and Washington are nearly completely blocked by something new. I call it the demonization of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. The personal vilification, where he's called regularly in the New York Times on the op-ed page by columnists who are supposed to represent our highest form of informed, enlightened commentary, where he is called a thug. Putin the thug. Putin the bandit. Putin the murderer. I entered the field during the Khrushchev era. I do not recall in all my years in Soviet studies the American media, the American political establishment personally vilifying a Soviet communist Russian leader the way they are Putin. And this has become an institution in the United States. When Hillary Clinton, who wants to be president of the United States, says Putin's Hitler, and if she becomes president, he's going to be eager to see her and talk about cooperation. Because if somebody's Hitler, you kill him. You don't negotiate with him. We know that. And the way Obama, with personal contempt, talks about Putin does not abet a solution. So this demonization of Putin has become another reason why this might be even more dangerous. And finally, this Cold War may be more perilous because there is no effective American opposition to it. I was on I would say the front lines. I was involved in what used to be called the pro-détente movement during the last Cold War. Those of us who wanted to tamp down the Cold War and seek cooperation. And it was a vigorous movement. We were in the minority, but we had allies in the White House, aides of the president, in the State Department, maybe a dozen senators, maybe a score or two of people in Congress. We had ready, easy access to the New York Times, the Washington Post, television and radio. There is none of that today. The handful of us, can you kill the echo? I think it's coming from the stationary mic. The handful of us today who oppose or are critical of the American contribution to this situation can find no allies in the State Department, Congress, and we can't get on the op-ed pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Post. The Nation magazine, for which I write, and as my wife likes to say, full disclosure, whatever that means. I'm not giving you the full disclosure, but partial disclosure, edited by my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, is a very important and has become on this issue, I think, the most important alternative medium in the United States. But it doesn't penetrate, for some reason, the walls of Congress or the White House. All the progressives, self-identified, seem to have voted for these congressional bills and resolutions last month, basically declaring war on Russia without debate. This is astonishing. This is a failure of our democracy. So the question becomes, how did this happen? How did this happen? After all, 25 years ago, when the Soviet Union ended, nearly 25 years ago, and the kids in the room, the young people in this room, excuse me for calling you kids, my daughter doesn't like that either, might not know this, but we were told by the Clinton administration for a decade nearly that there would now be an era of American-Russian strategic partnership and friendship, that Cold War was over forever, and that from now on we were allies with Russia. So how did this happen a quarter of a century later, that we're now in the worst conflict with Russia since the Cuban Missile Crisis? Now, the explanation that you know, because you hear it everywhere in the mainstream, daily, it's grown into an orthodoxy, a consensual explanation, is this. Back in the 1990s, under President Clinton and President Yeltsin of Russia, everything was good. Things were fine. And then came Putin in the year 2000, president of Russia, and he spoiled it all. In short, whatever bad has happened has nothing to do with American policy. It has all to do with Russia. Russia, or Putin personally, is to blame. Now, I'm going to talk about this, but before I do, because it was my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, who reminded me of it, that the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said something once that people forgot, but is crucial for all of us. He wasn't a politically correct man, so he put it only in the male gender. But he said, every man is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. That's good. That's essential. There look to be maybe 200 or more of you here. Your opinions, you are entitled to. Your facts, you are not. As at a good magazine, as at a good news agency, as at any news medium, you fact check your facts, and if they are wrong, they don't get to count. They're out. So let's proceed with Moynihan's adage. The orthodox, consensual view of how we got where we are with Russia, including the Ukrainian crisis, is based largely on historical fallacies and political myths, on Russophobia, a hangover from the old Cold War, and retrospective demonization of Putin. Consider these primary examples. Take the oldest historical myth that is the basis for this narrative. It goes like this. Since the end of the Soviet Union, Washington treated Moscow as a desired friend and partner. And in the end, Moscow was unable or unwilling to accept the American embrace and rejected it, slowly, but then emphatically under Putin. What's the historical reality? The Clinton administration, not only, but it was in power, got it in its head that the United States won the Cold War when the Soviet Union ended. It didn't bother them that Reagan, Gorbachev, and the first President Bush had all announced the Cold War was over 2 years before the Soviet Union ended in 1989. The Soviet Union ended in December 1991. But this was a good story. The Soviet Union ended, we won the Cold War. Teach our children this story. And we have taught our children this story, this false story, for nearly 25 years. And our politicians have acted on it, which meant, beginning with Clinton, his administration, that since we defeated the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia was kind of like Japan and Germany after World War II. Russia no longer had full sovereign rights or interest at home or abroad. We could dictate to Russia. We would help them. But in return, they were to be mindful of our preferences as to their domestic and foreign policy and act on them. The result was, I call it, a winner-take-all American policy in regard to Russia. You know, I don't have to tell you, it was spearheaded by the expansion of NATO, which is not a sorority, not a fraternity, not a charity, but a military organization. In fact, the largest military alliance in the world, most powerful. Its expansion, beginning under Clinton, all the way to Russia's borders. Now, we can argue whether that was a good or bad thing. I think it was a terrible thing. But there's an argument to be made it was a good thing. I'm open to hear the argument. But can we say it didn't happen? And Russia should have said, shall we say, oh, never mind, it's okay? As though if a Russian military, or a Chinese, let's say, military alliance showed up in Mexico tomorrow on the Rio Grande, we'd say, oh, great, we'd love to have more neighbors. We'd all be at the White House demanding Obama do something, nuke them. I mean, can we not walk in the other fellow's shoes for 1 minute and see what this looked like over 20 years as it was coming at Russia? And there was more. There was diplomacy, but it was American diplomacy marked by broken promises and concessions made by the Russians that were not reciprocated. Let me give the young people in the room an example they probably don't know about. After the United States was attacked on 9/11, first world leader to call President Bush was Putin. He said, George, it's horrible. We're with you. Tell us what we can do. We have major military assets in Afghanistan. They're yours. We have a fighting force. We have terrific intelligence. We have transit routes. It's all yours. And since Bush was going to send a land force to dislodge the Taliban, Bush took this, and it cost Putin a lot at home. His security people didn't like this, but he did it anyway. And Putin saved a lot of American lives in that war. Mark that down. What did he get in return? Trivia question. Within 2 years, I think, Bush had expanded NATO right to Russia's borders, and equally fateful, Bush took the United States unilaterally out of what was called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had been the most stabilizing nuclear treaty in the history of the world because it prohibited the kinds of missiles that could eliminate the other side's retaliatory response. And that led to missile defense, and that now led to the new controversy about building missile defense installations on Russia's borders. So that's what Putin got for saving American lives. So when you hear Putin say, but nobody listens to Putin. You might try reading his speeches. They're all at Kremlin.ru in English. I tried to make a partnership with the United States, and I was rebuffed. Remember what happened. And remember what it cost Putin politically at home. They still remind him of his trusting nature toward the Americans. That was a major turning point. Somewhere along the way, probably in the late 90s, certainly by the early part of the 20th century, in this American winner-take-all approach, Ukraine became the brass ring. Well, we've expanded NATO to the Baltics. And Brzezinski has told us that without Ukraine, Russia will never be a great power again. We believe that. So we need to get Ukraine into NATO, or at least into the EU with maybe a back channel to NATO. But first, Georgia, because that's the entry to Russia's soft underbelly in the Caucasus. So we had the 2008 war in Georgia, also a proxy war. Did that alert anybody this was a bad idea, that Russia had red lines? No. We pushed on. We pushed on to Ukraine. Maybe it's a good policy, but you can't deny the facts. So, along the way, and here's another bit of current punditry that we hear, oh, in Ukraine, Russia's destroying the European security system by annexing Crimea and supporting the fighters in East Ukraine. Maybe that's true, but Russia was systematically excluded from the European security system after the end of the Soviet Union because it wasn't brought into NATO. The cooperation with NATO was fictitious, and we were expanding NATO to its borders. In other words, we were building a European security system at the expense of NATO. So when we say to Putin, oh, you're destroying the security system, he said, yeah, it's your security system, it's not mine. Gorbachev and Reagan agreed on something very important. This is where Reagan became a great man. If you try to build your security in a way that the other guy thinks you're endangering his or her security, it is no security at all. All you'll get is mutual buildups. You have to do it in a way that each side, both sides, feel reassured and secure. Expanding NATO to Russia's borders was the obvious of that, the reverse of that. That's, by the way, why some young conservatives, and not young ones, who adore Reagan, see all this as a repudiation of Reagan's legacy. And they're right. If we just talked about Reagan in terms of what he did with Gorbachev, they're absolutely right. Certainly that's how the Russians have seen it. So now come to the current crisis and the myths. The American Orthodox assertion is that this is all due to Putin's aggression. That's the phrase, Putin's aggression. And here too we find myths, beginning with this fundamental one. And I apologize to Ukrainians or people of Ukrainian descent in the room, but I think if they think about it, they'll agree with me. All this talk of the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people striving to be free of Russian influence and join the West is, to put it politely, fragmentary. For centuries, Ukraine has been a divided country. It's not my fault. It's not Putin's fault. It's God's fault. Centuries of being formed from fragments of different empires left Ukraine divided religiously, ethnically, economically, politically, geographically. Mainly between the pro-Russian eastern provinces and the western provinces that look to Europe, but not only. You find both sides in central Ukraine, even in Kiev. When this crisis began, Ukraine had one state, but it wasn't, in the sense that the rhetoric has it, one country. It should have remained one country. It was struggling to do that after the end of the Soviet Union. But anybody who was going to tamper with this delicate balance in Ukraine either had an evil deed on his or her mind, or didn't know history, or didn't know Ukraine. So the civil war that we now see in Ukraine is not Putin's fault. It was latent, at very least, latent in Ukrainian society and history all along. That brings us to a related myth. In November 2013, the European Union, backed by Washington, offered, this is the myth, President Yanukovych of Ukraine a benign, generous association agreement with the European Union. But Putin bullied and bribed poor Yanukovych to refusing it, and then Yanukovych fell in the protests in the streets. What's the reality? The European Union proposal was a reckless provocation. It told Yanukovych, even though Putin had said, let's do a three-way plan to save Ukraine from meltdown, Moscow, Kiev, Brussels, it told Yanukovych, the European Union did, choose between Russia and us, the West. That was an ultimatum. Why would anybody do this? Nor was it so benign. The financial terms that the European Union was offering was virtually no money up front and austerity measures of the kind that Greece has just rejected in a vote and that savaged European society, 25% unemployment, for a decade. What would this have done to Ukraine, which was already on the financial ropes, with an elderly population dependent on pensions? What would this have done? Moreover, nobody seems to read anything anymore. But buried in the 1,000-page protocol was a section called Military Security Issues, which, if signed, Yanukovych and Ukraine would have been obliged to abide by Europe's military and security policies. NATO wasn't mentioned, but what are Europe's military and security policies? There are those of NATO. This was clearly an attempt. All right, let me take that back. This seems to have been an attempt, in fine print, to hook Ukraine to NATO, I'm mixing my metaphors, through the back door. So it wasn't all that benign, and Russia has lawyers, and they read everything, and they knew what was going on, or thought they did, and they weren't happy about it. So it wasn't Putin's aggression that initiated the crisis, but a kind of velvet aggression by Washington and Brussels to bring all of Ukraine into the West, and at least into the embrace of NATO. And here arises another myth. The Ukrainian civil war was triggered by Putin's aggressive response to peaceful demonstrations at the Maidan. The reality was different, and you will remember, because you saw it on TV. You saw the people in the streets throwing flaming Molotov cocktails. You saw that they were increasingly armed. You saw that people were being shot. You saw the burning barricades. You saw the assaults on government buildings. The reality is that by February, what had begun as peaceful protest had become violent. And the violence was inspired in part, in large part, by ultra-nationalist Ukrainian forces, some of whom indisputably any reasonable person would call neo-fascist. What does that mean? They want to rid Ukraine of Jews, gypsies, Russians, homosexuals, anybody who's not a pure ethnic Ukrainian, whatever that is after centuries of mixed marriage. That's their written ideology. Leave aside that they carry around pictures of Hitler. Maybe it's just ornamentation. Read their programs. So these people, small minority, got traction in the streets and influenced events. What happened? What happened? The violence grew. 3 European foreign ministers flew to Kiev, and they brokered an agreement between the president and the street demonstrators' leaders. They said, look, Yanukovych will form a coalition government. Bring in the opposition leaders. He will stay as president until December, February, December, whatever that is, 10 months. And then there'll be new elections. They brokered a democratic agreement. I don't know who initiated the phone call, but within minutes, Putin and Obama were on the phone with each other. Apparently, Obama said to Putin, do you support this? Putin said, I do. Putin said to Obama, do you support this? Obama said, I do. Within hours, it was overthrown as street protesters marched on the presidential palace. Yanukovych fled to Russia. A new government was formed and was immediately endorsed by the United States and Europe, the new government. Nobody ever mentioned in the West again the agreement that they had negotiated themselves, the Western diplomats. And out of that came all the rest. Out of that came all the rest. All the rest being Russia's annexation of Crimea, the rebellion in eastern Ukraine, the Civil War, the new American Cold War, and Merkel's desperate flight to Kiev, Moscow, and Washington in these last 2 or 3 days to ward off actual war. Finally, there's today's perilous fallacy, which Merkel seemed to publicly support, but apparently has rethought, though Obama has not. That all this will end only if Putin stops his aggression. That's it. We heard this from Kerry today. We heard it from McCain. We hear it from Peskaki, the spokesman at the State Department. Putin has to stop aggressing and everything will be okay. They call it, we're going to give him a diplomatic off-ramp, whatever that is, this cliche. They don't say what the diplomacy is. In other words, if he capitulates, we're good with that. Everything, we'll call off the sanctions, and he can have Russia, or at least part of it, and that's it, all over. But the reality is twofold. First, I ask you, and I ask anybody from Ukraine who knows Ukraine in this room, there are 4 to 5 million people still living in Donbass. Donbass is the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine. I don't know the numbers because so many have been turned in. We had a fact-checking problem, not I, but my wife did at The Nation. A very good piece about this on The Nation blog by Lev Galenkin, who was born in eastern Ukraine. He's an American citizen, writing about these people. Do these 5 million people have no humanity, no agency? The New York Times refers to them as Putin's thugs. Babies, grandmothers, grandfathers, mechanics, school teachers, nurses, miners, taxi cab drivers, merchants. They're all Putin's thugs. But what about their rights? They have been bombed by Kiev and mortared and shelled for a year. We don't know the exact casualty rates. The UN says 5,300. That can't be dead. There are thousands dead and wounded, gravely wounded. The refugee count, people who have had to flee the area, somewhere between 1 and 2 million. We don't know what it is. The UN is not sure. Russia's not sure. So many people. And they flee as we talk. Why do they flee tonight? Because they're still being bombed. At first, it was the women folk taking the children. Now the young men are fleeing too. And some are coming from Kiev because they're being conscripted and they don't want to fight. Russia claims 500 young men are coming. I don't know, Russia lies too. Who knows? 500 a day are arriving in Russia fleeing conscription. I mean, this is a humanitarian disaster of the first magnitude. And yet the United States has said since the Clinton administration, R2P, right to protect, is our doctrine. We protect people who are put in a humanitarian disaster situation by natural or warfare means. But the United States government has nothing to say about the fate of these people. Even though the American ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, was the great ideologue of this whole doctrine. And when asked, what did she say? I think Kiev has shown remarkable restraint. I am ashamed as an American citizen that a representative of my government could not bring herself to say, we feel badly for these people, we're going to do something to help them. Now, belatedly, apparently they're sending a few $1 million. But meanwhile, they've tried to stop those Russian white trucks. Remember all those white trucks we were shown? They were supposed to be carrying military equipment, but every one that's been opened has had baby food, penicillin, and water, and stuff like that. I mean, maybe they've stashed some weapons in there. So what? These people are starving. The infrastructure is destroyed. You can't get fresh water. The hospitals are being destroyed. Do they have no agency in this controversy, in this discussion? What about Kiev's aggression, backed by the United States? This terrible destruction is done by Kiev under what it calls, and I quote, an anti-terrorist operation. That's the name of Kiev's military operation. It's been that since April. They call it today, that to the day, and the United States has endorsed it. I ask you, what kind of government declares 5 million of its own citizens terrorists? And if you say people are a terrorist, is it your notion to negotiate with them or to kill them? What's the American policy? We don't negotiate with terrorists. We do, but officially we don't. We kill them. There's something wrong here. And what's wrong in Kiev is endorsed in Washington. And that bothers me as an American citizen, but it is also the reason that the solution cannot be only the end of Putin's aggression. So, this is the actual history. Now let's go back to Moynihan. Maybe I haven't told you the truth. And probably there's some people who think I got it wrong. My facts are correct. I make mistakes, but I correct them. I'm a scholar. If I get my facts wrong, I'm cabbage. Now, my analysis and interpretation, or what Moynihan called my opinions, they may be incorrect. My brain may not be able to handle these facts, to process them. And that's possible. And I'm open to being corrected about my interpretation. But let us say, to conclude this evening, or this part of it, that I'm half right only. Give me half. What would this mean if I'm half right? It means that Putin's behavior has been substantially reactive. He's been reacting to American Western policy. Now, maybe he reacted unwisely. I think he did in some cases. But to call this aggression? So it means, arguably, that the worst international crisis in decades cannot be blamed solely on Putin, that we bear some responsibility for it and should own up and think about it and see if we can negotiate. Secondly, means we may be racing to war with Russia on the basis of a false narrative, even official falsehoods. Third, it means that America, the self-proclaimed greatest democracy in the world, sometimes I think we are, sometimes I'm not so sure, is going to war without any public debate whatsoever in the mainstream political media establishment. That's not the way we're supposed to sit down and think this through, even regarding the run-up to Iraq. Those of us who opposed the war lost the debate, but we were given a debate. We were featured on op-ed pages and on TV. We had a debate. We should worry about this. And that's not all. Here's where I don't know the answers. Things have happened along the way that have brought us to this moment that we have not been told the full truth about, though I don't know what the full truth is. At each stage, a mysterious event occurred that protracted and deepened the Ukrainian crisis and the new Cold War. And each remains tonight a question without a clear answer. In November 2013, why did Washington and Brussels impose an either-or choice on the democratically elected president of a divided Ukraine? What was wrong with Putin's tripartite, three-way, let's all chip in agreement? What was wrong with that? We need an explanation. In February 2014, who organized the sniper attacks at Maidan that killed 100 people, led to more street riots, and eventually Yanukovych's fleeing? Who was behind those snipers? At that time in February, I ask again, why didn't the European foreign ministers and President Obama defend the negotiated settlement that they had brokered and say to the protesters, no, wait and vote against Yanukovych in December? You can wait 8 or 9 months, and meanwhile, your people are going to be in his government. Why didn't we do that? We don't know. But do we deserve an answer? In early May, a horrible event, by anybody's standard, occurred in Odessa. 48 people, almost, were burned alive in a sealed building. Pro-Russians. Who did that and why? Why was it never investigated? Why did Kerry say, gee, that was a terrible thing, and move on and never ask for an investigation? Why did we not demand that our client government in Kiev conduct a real investigation? Why has that massacre, which evoked the horrors of Nazi extermination squads in Ukraine in World War II, why was that just passed over? And who did it? It was clearly organized. And who shot down in July Malaysian jetliner 17? all 298 people aboard. Who shot that down and why? Was it an accident? Was it a book? Was it a Ukrainian military fighter plane? And who was standing there with the artillery on the ground, the book? And since the Minsk Accords, which called for a ceasefire negotiation, were signed in September, who has repeatedly violated the ceasefire since then, making sure no negotiations occurred? Is that the question Merkel wants to ask Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, Putin, and then Obama? Because she's been calling for negotiations. But every time she does, somebody violates the ceasefire. Maybe she's now interested in who's doing that. Here's the point. Washington, NATO, and Kiev all have an answer to each of these questions. And all the answers point toward Moscow. All blame Moscow. No American newspaper has shown any investigative interest in these cases. The New York Times has money to send a crew for months to Moscow to investigate the Russian textbook industry to discover that Putin's cronies are profiting there. They could have rung me up on Upper West Side of New York, and I could have told them the exact story they printed, because a lot of my colleagues in Russia are complaining about it. But they don't have any money to go and investigate the shoot down of that airplane, or the snipers, or go to the front lines and see who's investigating, who's violating the ceasefire. Meanwhile, around the world, there are independent investigations that are claiming that the official American answer is untrue in each of these cases. Are these other investigations true? I do not know. I don't have the brain power or the knowledge, the resources to investigate, but I think somebody should. So it means that in this respect, we may now be racing to war in a very thick fog of war on the basis of lies or uncertainties. So I need to end by asking, what now? You know the old Russian questions, что делать? And probably the answer is ничего слишком поздно. Nothing, it's too late. I don't know. When I ask what now, I only know some of the facts to return to Moynihan. So my opinion is not perhaps what it should be. Here's what I think is the case. The pro-war parties are now ascendant in most of the capitals directly involved. Washington, if you wonder who the leader is, of course, it's Senator McCain. Kerry's lent his weight, certainly Vice President Biden. Kiev, Brussels, NATO headquarters, and possibly, I'm not sure, in Moscow. There's a struggle going on in Moscow. Putin did not initiate this crisis. Contrary to the orthodox version, it is very bad for him personally and very bad for Russia's national interest. He wants it ended. He isn't going to capitulate, but he wants it ended. It can be ended by a negotiated settlement based on some variations of the following, which were agreed to in Geneva in April 2014 by Kerry, by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, by the representatives of Kiev, by Germany, and by France. Some variations are the following: a complete ceasefire, withdrawal of all heavy equipment, military equipment, from the front lines by both sides, some kind of federated Ukrainian state or decentralized Ukrainian state that gives all the regions, not just the eastern regions, but the western regions, the right to a degree to follow their own traditions. By the way, governors are not elected in Ukraine, they're appointed in Kiev. We don't do that. That doesn't mean our way is the right way, but there are alternative ways to the way Kiev does it. And there are language and other issues. A militarily non-aligned Ukraine. That means, let me be clear, Ukraine will never, ever, 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 for eternity, be a member of NATO. Now what we're offering is, NATO membership is not on the agenda today. Well, neither is going to Mars, but we're trying. The Russians want a flat written commitment, even though they know we'll probably break it. They want a piece of paper, which they neglected to get for promises made in the past. And a Ukraine, vitally important for the well-being of the people of Ukraine, free to trade with Russia and with the West, free to trade with both. Understand that even after a year of war, Russia remains Ukraine's essential financial, trading, economic partner by far. Ukraine cannot survive with Russia, and Russia needs Ukraine economically. It's good for both of them. And Ukraine should be allowed to do the same with the West, as has Russia been for the last 20 years. Ukraine shouldn't be told either you trade with us or you trade with Russia, but not both. Not both. And a guarantee of Ukraine's current territorial sovereignty, but without Crimea. That train left the station. But the rest of Ukraine stays intact. And that is guaranteed by the great powers and possibly by United Nations resolution. Is there still time for such a reasonable settlement? I have no idea. It was attainable in April, May, maybe June. It may be that too much blood has now been shed. The people in eastern Ukraine were not, for the most part, separatists, though we always called them that when this began. They called themselves federalists. They wanted home rule of some degree. Now, what you hear, if you watch the social media videos, we can't live with these people anymore. They killed my grandmother, my grandfather, and my daughter. I'm not living with these Kiev anymore. Maybe that can be overcome. The Confederacy said the same thing about the Union after the Civil War, but we paid a price, decades of price, to finally hold the nation together. I don't know. I don't know. There are only two possibilities for this kind of solution, and that requires leadership. One is Merkel, because of her special position. Germany's the strongest country of Europe. Her policy, her position has been to say there can be no military solution and then cave in to America's anti-Russian, pro-sanction policies. Maybe her flight yesterday and tonight is a change of mind. I don't know. But the only person who can end this in terms of negotiation is Obama. Obama controls NATO, or Washington does, controls the International Monetary Fund, which will have to help pick up the bill. He seems to be drifted toward the war party. I voted for him twice. I'd like to think that this is because he hasn't heard any opposition to the war party. He hasn't felt the heat, because we haven't made ourselves heard. I don't mean you, I mean the people I talk to. And the truth is, I'd say to the young people in this room, because suddenly, somehow, I became a grandfather, that my generation and your parents' generation have let you down. We haven't given you a choice. We haven't put it out there so you could think about what's right and wrong and what to do. We failed you. We haven't given you this democratic debate. So you, the young people in the room, now can do what you think right. Maybe nothing, maybe something. As for me, and I end on this note, my hopes in despair rise and fall with the day's news. I'm slightly happy that Merkel's on an airplane. She's worried. Good. But usually I remember what Russians say about being a pessimist and an optimist. They define a pessimist and an optimist differently than we do. Conditioned by their own Russian traumatic history, they say, a pessimist thinks things cannot possibly get worse, and an optimist knows they can. So I leave you tonight an optimist, and I thank you for having me on this really great anniversary occasion. I guess I don't need this. So they've asked me to wave to people who'd like to say something, and I would propose we did it like this. Can you believe this? That I had my hairbrush in my back pocket. When I took it out, it took out the mic, which Gabe is, you want to use, here, Gabe. Yeah. Okay. So I think let's do this. I'll point to someone, because I don't know your names. I don't mean to be rude. Ask if anybody else wants to say something on that subject or theme. I'll respond, and we'll move on. So may I, somebody, I don't have very good eyesight, so somebody, yes, ma'am, in the lovely sweater.
Yes, I have a question about the nature of the Civil War. You mentioned several times the fragmentary nature of Ukraine, like many other Eastern European countries. But at the time that Russia usurped Crimea, I wouldn't have really thought of this necessarily as a civil war. And I was wondering if you would define better, or more specifically, the nature of the rebels, the people we were talking about, the rebels at that time, who they were and where they had gotten their weapons and why they were seemingly at the ready.
So we have a question about the nature of the fighting people in eastern Ukraine and the origins of the Ukrainian Civil War. Anybody else on that theme? Because if so, well, I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but I had to learn a lot more than I knew when this began. Here's what we know. I've already spoken about the history of divisions in Ukraine. And many countries have these kinds of divisions and live on without civil war, but most of them do not have a unitary state the way Ukraine did, where all decisions, including budgetary ones, were made in Kiev. One reason why that was done, everybody agrees, even the government in power, that since the end of the Soviet Union, the Kiev government has been an exceptionally corrupt government. Whether they're in the opposition or power, they've been feeding off state revenues. So everybody was happy to have all decisions made in Kiev so they could enrich themselves. So you had a very unitary government. You had these historical divisions in Ukraine. You had Russian speakers, non-Russian speakers. A lot of intermarriage, though, tens of millions of intermarriage. Gorbachev, for example, his mother was Ukrainian, and his beloved wife, Raisa, was Ukrainian. So as he said the other day, my soul is split. My soul is split. What we know from polling agencies is that when the controversy began in November, December, January, now we're into early 2014, only about, and I got to remember, but about 25% of people living in eastern Ukraine wanted to leave Ukraine and either be a separate state or join Russia. So it was a minority. After Russia annexed Crimea, and Russia says it didn't annex it, it reunited with Crimea because Crimea had been for centuries part of Russia. That issue was reframed in eastern Ukraine. How many want what happened in Crimea? Would you like to be annexed by Russia? And the number didn't change. Then when Kiev began the attacks on particularly Donetsk and Luhansk, in Russian called Lugansk, opinion against Kiev began to grow for separation or autonomy, but they didn't want to be in a government, in a state with Kiev any longer. And the numbers show that that, of course, has grown as more and more people have been killed. So I would conclude that the moment to hold Ukraine together in one state, the prime moment was still spring 2014, and that's why Russia, America, France, Germany, and Ukraine went to Geneva and signed that agreement, predicated on a ceasefire. So I end, though, with the question, given the blood that's been shed, is it still possible? And it's a question mark in my mind. Now, that's what Putin's calling for. That's what Merkel's calling for. But Poroshenko, the president, I should add this, the president of Ukraine, though he calls for it occasionally, he has very little power. I would say he's president in name only, that the real power in Kiev is held by others who constantly threaten to be done with him. They say, we will do with you what we did with Yanukovych if you do X, Y, and Z. So he doesn't have much running room. That's all I know. Ashmi. Well, the question really is Obama running our policy toward Russia and Ukraine? That's the essence of it. He said something a couple days ago, and I was on TV the other day on Democracy Now!, and they played the clip, and I said, I don't think he understands either the question he was given or the episode, because he answered the question in a very damaging way, which suggested to me he was thinking of something else. But the broader question is important. I would like to think that Obama has not crafted this policy, that it's been given to him by other people, and being not a whole lot interested in all this, or not very well informed about this, he kind of got ensnared. That would make me feel a little better. But unfortunately, that's not the job description of being President of the United States. That if you don't know much or you don't care much, you get a pass. So as Harry Truman said, the buck stops there at Obama's desk. And I think it's going, if this plays out, whatever remains of his reputation as President of the United States, this may finish it. And that would sadden me greatly, and I will tell you why. I grew up in the segregated South. I grew up in a completely segregated society, American apartheid. I would have voted for Obama if he couldn't walk or talk, simply because he was a black man. I saw it as historical justice. And I would hate to see the first African-American president of the United States go down in history in a very bad way. So I hope, and there's one thing that I remember, that at the last minute, Reagan changed his mind about Russia. He had a failing presidency. His own party was sick of him. But Reagan had a bee in his bonnet. He hated nuclear weapons. And somebody told him Gorbachev hated nuclear weapons. And then this woman told him, and by the way, Gorbachev was baptized as a little peasant baby. And Reagan thought, not knowing that all Russian peasant kids were baptized in the Soviet era, just in case, that a Christian who'd been baptized could not be a real communist. So here he had Gorbachev, a guy who hated nuclear weapons and wasn't a real communist, and by God, he needed a foreign policy legacy, and the rest is history. So when I think about Obama, he's got a year and a half or two left. But I think things are moving so fast now that if they send these weapons, I don't think Russia will stand idly by. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Cohen, I very much liked your opening remarks saying that, quoting Senator Moynihan, that every person has the right to his opinion but not the right to his facts. Unfortunately, I must say that you stand on the other side. For example, Ukraine had law that did not allow Ukraine to enter into NATO, which was revoked with coming of Poroshenko. That's one thing. So NATO was not the cause for the annexation or anything. Secondly, if you recall the role of Igor Streltsov in Crimea and also yes, Strelkov in Crimea and also in eastern part. So there were agents sent by Russia who worked for them. Yes, Strelkov came from Moldova, and he did his job there, and he continued in Crimea, and he continued in Donbas region until there was a total reshuffling, and to make sure that all the leadership would be in natives of Donbas. Well, I would like to ask you this. We know that a great deal of influence, and Mr. Putin has Mr. Dugin. Mr. Dugin has defined himself as a fascist, and I really would like to
Okay.
see people,
I got
just
you.
let me finish. I would like to see the people here actually Google it and find out who Mr. Dugin is, who is admirer of Hitler and etc. You spell it D-U-G-I-N. And so, speaking of fascists, speaking of who is influencing who, ordering the facts, I think one has to look at the other side. And I think I find your presentation extremely one-sided.
Fair enough. You were doing great until you got to Dugin.
No.
Well, let me finish now. I listened to you. I happen to know this story very well, and Alexander Dugin. I wouldn't call him a fascist, but I wouldn't want him to marry my daughter either. He has no connection with Putin whatsoever, and in fact, Putin had him fired from Moscow State University. So this is a myth that Dugin, who writes a lot of crazy things on the internet, speaks for Putin. Does Michael Savage speak for President Obama? Oh, you all don't know who Michael Savage is? All right, how about, what's the other guy? The guy who's got the big radio show. All right, does Rush Limbaugh speak for Obama? All right, let's go to the serious point you make. Were Russian agents in Ukraine helping to organize the resistance there? That's your point. Strelkov and others. 100% yes. I didn't deny this fact. Were there any American agents in Kiev and elsewhere organizing? Well, it's true for Victoria Nuland was only handing out cookies on Maidan. But she later told the Senate she'd spent $5 billion preparing for this. So the reality is, pity Ukraine, which has become the hunting ground of great powers. Fascism has nothing to do with it. We could find fascists everywhere, even in the United States. The point is that the United States has been seeking, let me reword it, a faction in Washington has been seeking to bring Ukraine into NATO for a long time. You say no, but what about 2008, where Bush attempted to bring Ukraine and Georgia on a fast track into NATO, and Merkel vetoed it? That counts. That's a fact. Now, it might have been an unwise thing to do. It might have been letting the cat out of the bag. But these are the facts. The interpretation you put on it is fine. I mean, if I take your position, fascist on both sides, both meddling in Ukraine, then I say a curse on both their houses. But we're still going to war. Yep. I got a little tiny
The
microphone.
price of oil worldwide has dropped significantly.
Half.
What do you expect the impact of that will be? Because Russia is certainly key to Russia's economy.
Well, being the genius that I am, I can tell you one thing. A lot of Americans who haven't taken summer vacations in recent years because of the price of gasoline will be hitting the road this summer. And I'll be happy not to be paying $3 and what were we paying? $3.50 a gallon last summer. This is a terrible blow to Russia. For reasons that are historical, Russia has depended, its federal budget has depended about somewhere between 40 and 50% on oil gas revenues, which were at historic highs over the last 7 or 8 years, dollar or more. Gas prices are linked to oil prices. So if oil prices are high, gas prices, natural gas is high. It wasn't only Russia. Look at North Ireland. Look at Texas. A lot of people are going to have trouble. But for Russia, it's a major problem. The short answer is they've been through it before. They'll get through it again. They have $400 billion of hard currency. Their sovereign and corporate debt next year and the year after is about $150 billion a year. So if the state wants to pay those debts, they will get through it without oil prices going up. They still sell a lot of weapons around the world. They still build a lot of nuclear reactors. They have revenue. But this is a blow, but it's not a crippling blow. Sometimes when we hear these stories, we say, how can they manage? But maybe we ought to remind ourselves that Russia's debt is 10% of its GDP. Ours is more than 100%. In other words, Russia can pay its bills without printing money. We cannot. We print money to pay our debt. What's going to happen in Russia is belt tightening, reallocation of resources, and inflation. Ordinary people always pay the price. The longer-term consequence of the sanctions, which hurts Russia and they can't borrow or extend their debt with Western banks, is that Russia will turn east. It's already signed nearly $600 billion worth of contracts with China, India, the BRICS countries. Everybody wants what Europe's not taking anymore. It's possible this won't be temporary, that Russia's leaving the West, politically and economically. And when this is over, we will now be looking at it east, led by Russia and China. And the markets will have gone there. I'm not sure. But at the moment, they're desperately in search of lenders and markets outside the West. Will they find enough to replace what they're losing? No. But one reason that Merkel's on that airplane is because there's 6,000 German enterprises whose profits depend exclusively on the Russian market. So it's not yet clear whether this sanctions policy will hold. The oil prices obviously are not going to go back up anytime soon. So it's a big problem, big problem. But it's not going to bring Putin or the political class to its knees. The people always pay the price. They'll pass the cost on to the people, same way we do. All the way in the back, way in the back, young woman in the white something, her sweater or jacket. Why are you looking behind me, behind you? You are the last, yeah. You are the very last.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen, for being here. I wonder if you would speculate, as a scholar of social phenomena and as the husband of an editor, a little bit about why the Western media has become such an echo chamber.
Say the last part.
Why the Western media has become such an echo chamber in the last few months.
Katya, ты хочешь ответить? She doesn't want to answer. Well, my first advice is, if you're a writer, never sleep with the editor. Because the editor then takes the view she can't give you an extra 100 words because it'll look like she's favoring you. Everybody else gets an extra 100 words, but not me. So there's no real advantage there. We think about this all the time. In the past, I think the New York Times and the Washington Post did a pretty professional job of covering the last Cold War. They had a rule, and I guess it came from journalism school or practices somewhere, that you know how reporters, they tell a story and then they go get somebody to comment on it? That they had to get somebody who had an opposing view. They had to be 2 sound bites or drops in that piece. And since I was often the person, they'd call me up and say, Professor Pipe says that Brezhnev is going to attack the United States tomorrow based on this story we've reported. What do you think? I say, I think Professor Pipes is a wacko, and he's wrong. And then they get the 2 points of view. So what would the readers see? That 2 pointy heads, one at Harvard, one at Princeton, drew different conclusions from the Times story, and so should the Times readers. They don't do that anymore. I can give you a list of the 7 people they go to, and it's always the same 7, and they write the story so that they can punch in what they know this man or woman's going to say, and they do. They are omitting vast stories. Why, for example, with all their resources, were there no war correspondents from the Times or the Washington Post in the Donbass? Well, one reason is you could get killed down there. But that's how you win Pulitzer Prizes. That's what newspaper reporters do if they want to be a war correspondent. There were plenty from France, from European countries, from Russia. But we don't get to, we say, oh, the Russians propaganda. We don't listen to them. All right, leave the Russians out. So they didn't send anybody down there. Kramer went in occasionally, wrote a story and left. He went in and saw old women and babies living in basements. He wrote that and he never went back. Never went back to find out if they died in the basement. So I can't explain that. They're not out of money. They don't have balance in their coverage. And basically, the worst thing is, to my point of view, and watch the byline, they file a story from either Kiev or Moscow, and the first paragraph begins like this. According to Ukrainian Kievian military spokesman, 9,000 Russian troops crossed the border last night. All right. Then comes 6 paragraphs of explaining what this means. And in the last paragraph, it says, this report cannot be confirmed. Then it should not have been in the newspaper. They should have bloody well confirmed it and then reported it. In other words, they don't do any fact-checking. They're reading the handouts of the governments that they like. That's the State Department and Kiev. Why do they do it? I don't know. They say the fish rots from the top. In the old days, and I was offered a job by the New York Times in 1976 to 77 to go to Moscow as one of its 2 correspondents. So I saw the top in 1980. He was a scary guy, the top, Abe Rosenthal. He looked just like my father. I almost passed out. I thought, oh my God, my father's judging me again. But they were tough. They didn't let this stuff happen at the times. I guess the culture, the people, the generation, but journalism schools don't seem to be interested in this malpractice either, or the journals published by journalism schools. If nobody cares, it means we now just take it for granted. That's the way it is. So the short answer is I don't know, but it's pretty bad. But your generation doesn't depend on these publications. You go onto the internet, you could punch in 9,000 Russian troops cross into Ukraine, and you'll get 7 different versions of what's happening. So good for you. I mean, good for you all. I can't do it. I don't know how to maneuver the internet.
Yes, I have a lot of questions around here because a good friend of mine is here who's come a long distance to hear this talk. And I don't want you to avoid his questions because he's lived in Ukraine for a number of years.
Good.
And he's suffered through the Euromaidan.
Good.
George has some questions for you.
Somebody give George a microphone. This is the guy that showed up in English.
Okay, my name is George Sayevich. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, and I didn't plan to be here. I just happened to be in Hunter Mountain, New York, skiing with friends when I saw on my Facebook page the announcement that Dr. Cohen would be speaking here. And I knew I had to come in order to try to, at least to some extent, present the Ukrainian side in all of this. Dr. Cohen has had the opportunity to, I think, appear 3 times on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, et cetera, and now venues like this. The Ukrainian side has not been heard. And I thought I was in a unique position to present it because of my heritage, an American of Ukrainian descent, who has worked for 36 years at the Voice of America Ukrainian desk as a TV and radio journalist. I was, for 2.5 years, the top level, or probably the only top level interpreter for the White House, the State Department. I was at least 12 times in Ukraine at the time Ukraine and the U.S. were establishing diplomatic relations and talking about Ukraine's nuclear deterrent. And I think I'm fully qualified, especially since I've spent the past year minus 2 one-month trips home. This is my 3rd one now. In Kyiv and on the Maidan since February 2nd as a member of the Maidan Self-Defense Unit 27, which I took with me to the skiing trip to show my friends. So I got it here. And I was severely injured by the Berkut riot police, they're called. I think they are a terrorist organization. If I had time, I would convince you of this. The day that I was hurt, I had no doubt they had orders not to restore order, but to kill. And I could see how they used their batons, cracked my motorcycle helmet wide apart. I was lucky, escaped death by that much. They did kill at least 10 people. I saw the bodies. They had the help of some people called titushte, which are thugs helping out the police in conjunction with them. And I would be able successfully to challenge every single major position that Dr. Cohen has articulated. And I'm confident of that. I spent a year there, talked to a lot of the people involved. Our unit, 27, very few people left in Kyiv because most of our members are in the East fighting. This is the basis of the so-called volunteer battalions. They were the only ones available to protect Ukraine because the regular army, down to I think 4,000 capable soldiers, had been destroyed by Yanukovych appointing 2 Russian nationals as ministers of defense. They did the job. And what Dr. Cohen said about a civil war in Ukraine, no civil war. There's no basis for a civil war. I was at the barricades with Russian speakers, no problem at all. Back and forth, Ukrainian, Russian, half the people fighting in Donbass are Russian speakers, and they call themselves Ukrainian patriots. There's an organization called the Organization of Russian-Speaking Ukrainian Nationalists. I hope that says something. It's not at all, like Dr. Cohen says. There is no separatist movement there. There is the second phase of Russia's war to destroy Ukraine. If given time, I could not prove it to you, but maybe get you to think. That's why, even if there is a ceasefire, and maybe even a peace agreement, that's not the end of it, because Putin's goal is to destroy Ukraine as a state. He had a meeting with President Bush. I think it was at Bush's ranch. And he said, you know, George, there really isn't such a country as Ukraine. And none of the American Russia experts picked this up. He made a stupid mistake saying that, but he got away with it. And so that's an indication. You have to see how they've acted, not only that they took Ukrainian territory, Crimea and in the east, how they did it, without any regard for how Ukrainians might remember this. This whole idea of Ukrainians and Russians are being brothers, that's gone. Early on, there was a Ukrainian poetess. I think she wrote a poem, "We are no longer brothers," or "we never were brothers." A lot of bitterness. Okay, if I may, I have one question to ask, is that right? Okay, I just want to say the whole idea of Maidan being a project of the United States, CIA or whoever, to harm Russia by removing the pro-Russian President Yanukovych, blah, blah. Totally absurd. Maidan, the greatest experience in my life as a human being, was spontaneous. No American influence or initiative. It was not about some kind of trade agreement or, as Putin says, for the right of Ukrainians to wash German toilets.
George, would you please ask your question and
Sure.
wrap this up?
Okay. Doctor, this will be a kind of step question because it depends on what Dr. Cohen says. Dr. Cohen, you claim that Viktor Yanukovych, no matter what, I can't think of the worst word that I would like to use, the lowest of the low, that he was, in fact, whatever, the legal, constitutionally elected president of Ukraine. The Constitution of Ukraine says that no felon can even run as a candidate for higher office. Yanukovych, twice convicted of felonies, twice served time, pay off for whatever constitutional court justices to lose those files. He had no right to run even. In your a question to you. Do you think do you still think that Yanukovych was the legally elected, constitutionally elected president of Ukraine?
So it's always good to have a second point of view. And it's good that George, who's appeared elsewhere, I'm sure, and has been prepared, has his statement. Around the country, a handful of people, such as myself, have been invited to give talks, and someone representing either themselves or something called the Ukrainian American Organization of Patriots shows up. They don't ask a question, but they demand close to equal time, which I don't mind, except it's cold out. You people probably want to go home, and we have an event after this. I don't want to be impolite to, I forgot your last name, sorry, George.
Sayevich.
You sure?
Sayevich.
Sayevich. Much of what he says has some basis in fact. But to deconstruct everything he said, and whether or not I think Yanukovych should have been allowed to be candidate for president of the Ukraine because he had a minor conviction as a kid, I have no idea. I'm not a Ukrainian. He was allowed to be on the Ukrainian ballot. And by the way, on this question of Yanukovych, it's not my opinion, but all the electoral organizations that monitor elections in post-Soviet states said that the presidential election that Yanukovych won was the fairest presidential election in the history of post-Soviet states, including Russia. I have no expertise to judge that, but that's what they said. And anybody who wants democracy for Ukraine would not overthrow a president, still more one who only had 8 or 9 months left in office. I voted twice for Obama. I am very angry at Obama, but I wouldn't ask you, George, to join me in throwing Molotov cocktails at the White House to get rid of Obama. That is not, George, unfortunately, democracy. It's something else. It's a tradition.
What is it?
It's a tradition that you evidently carry with you and believe in. All the rest you say is interesting, but it's less interesting because we can read about it in the New York Times, the Washington Post, we hear it in the Kiev Post, we hear it on Voice of America, we hear it every day. What should happen, of course, is that George should be given time to prepare, equal time, and there should be a debate, but not with me, with another Ukrainian. Because here, you see, is where George isn't being upfront with us. The Ukrainian people are being victimized by the Russians, but he hasn't said anything about the 5 million in the Donbass. He hasn't told us what his political allegiance was in Kiev when the violence started. We don't know if he's a member of Right Sector. We don't know where George came from. So we don't know who he is. I'm completely upfront with you who I am. I have no secrets. George is a kind of mysterious guy. He's a kind of interesting guy. And I like his jacket, but we don't know where he's coming from. So the best debate would be between George representing this point of view, which is widespread in Ukraine, and a Ukrainian political figure who is essentially in civil war with George, at least political civil war. That would be the way this should go, because tonight, for me, it's a debate, no disrespect, and maybe you're an American citizen, but for now, for me, this is a debate we Americans need to have. It's about our policy, not about Ukraine's policy.
Thank you very much, Dr.